I love the way that we identify who we are as a congregation, as a people, as a community in the world. I love the way that we embrace our core values, proclaim them, and strive to live out our core values of inclusion and justice and spirituality. We talk about the core values as if they were separate things. But I invite you to think about it in a little bit different way. That in our fragmented reality, our core values can compete and conflict with each other. That sometimes justice alienates people, especially people who may emphasize inclusion. And inclusion can be pushed so far that we become too shallow to mean or represent anything in the world. It's helpful to distinguish between inclusion, justice, and spirituality, but I want to remind all of us that in the realm of God, that in the hidden wholeness of reality, these three core values are part of a greater wholeness that is hidden from us on this side of death. The best we can do is to see reality as if looking through a glass darkly, as the King James Version would say. But we should not be confounded by that. But instead, we can stand in the mystery and be in awe of life and be in awe of the hidden wholeness that gives us a glimpse from time to time, blesses us with grace, fills our spirit, gives us hope, and energizes us to do the works of service and justice. You see, as a community of faith, we have a lot of assumptions. We assume there is more to life than we can see, hear, touch, or measure with our sciences. We assume that life is better than death and that love is stronger than fear and stronger than hate. We assume that despite the horrors, the intentional cruelty, and the random violence in this life, that life is still good and every breath is a gift. We assume that the underlying structures of all of creation are always leaning toward a shalom, a wholeness, which is the whole package of peace and justice. And because we can't see it, because we look through a glass darkly, we are strengthened and held together by love. Faith, hope, love, abide. The greatest of these is love. We assume that living as if the hidden wholeness of peace and justice and spirituality was already a reality. We live as if. And when we do that, we are overcoming the brokenness and fragmentation of the world. Now, there are some things about all of these assumptions that we make. First, we know there are assumptions. And that should always keep us humble. Many of our sisters and brothers of the faith do not think these things are assumptions, but instead they think they are propositional truths that somehow fell out of the sky off of God's writing desk. But that's not us. We know they are assumptions, and yet we live in them. And as we live in them, we make them real. And this leads me to the second thing about our assumptions, and that is people who hold the opposite assumptions, people who would say that there is no more to life than what we can see, feel, touch, hear, measure with our senses, are people who feel that hate and destruction is stronger than love and peace. People who have those opposite assumptions, their lives are small and they build a cruel world. And that is not who we are. By holding our assumptions about life and life's deep goodness and that love is the greatest power in the universe, we reject the world that is built by the cynics. We reject the world that is built by fearful hearts. We reject the world that is built by narrow minds. And we reject the world built by those people who hoard power instead of sharing it. Now we're going through a discernment process for identifying our next wedge blade ministry, and we begin with the assumption that the movement of history is a movement from fragmentation to wholeness. Our ministries, friend, are secondarily about us. Our ministries are primarily about us being co-creators with God to make life good for all people. Again, this is an assumption. But I think the truth of it reveals itself every day. And this is why we have celebrations. We have celebrations as part of our worship service every Sunday because we are proclaiming a movement from fragmentation to wholeness, from brokenness to healing. And our time of celebration is a sacrament and a proclamation of our partnership with God to build a better life for all people. Now, I want to go one step further. Our time of celebration is actually a corporate spiritual discipline. For the record, let me say, I like corporate spiritual disciplines. Corporate, shared spiritual disciplines as a community, they flip my gizzard. Now, all of us, as the song was sung and says, all of us want to know our true self, and all of us want to be known, and all of us want to be loved for who we are. It is in this knowing and interaction that we experience intimacy. The different paths for intimacy and identity, for knowing and being known, these are all spiritual disciplines. Prayer, as Troy talked about it, that's an obvious path for intimacy with God. And the more we set aside time for prayer and make it a priority in our daily life, the deeper prayer becomes a spiritual discipline. Now, I know us as a bunch of progressive theological liberals. Please note, I didn't say political liberals. Theological liberals. We resist the word discipline because it seems harsh, it seems rigid, it seems punitive, especially when discipline is connected with religion. We may get all these images of discipline and religion. It conjure up these images of nuns with rulers slapping our hands, or pilgrims with a stockade, a pillory in the public square. But I would ask you to think of spiritual disciplines in a more positive way. to think of it the way Richard Foster encourages us to think of it. When we are disciplined with our money, it gives us more freedom. And when we are disciplined with our money, we have more joy and we have more choices. In other words, discipline is not punitive or rigid or confining. Discipline leads to greater freedom, experience of connection, and a deeper understanding of ourselves and others. Discipline is not confining, but it is defining. And so over the next several weeks, I want to add to the list of corporate spiritual disciplines. And today I want to add grieving as a corporate spiritual discipline. The better we grieve together, the better we heal together. Grief is a deep sorrow and sadness because of a death of someone we love. We understand this, and most all of us have experienced this. Grief is not limited to a response to death. Grief is a multifaceted response to loss, particularly to the loss of someone or something that has died, to which a bond or affection was formed. But we also grieve when we lose a job. We grieve when our kids leave home, come back, leave home, come back, and leave home again. Although conventionally focused on the emotional response to loss, grief also has physical and cognitive, behavioral, social, cultural, spiritual, and philosophical dimensions. Because loss and grief are woven into the fabric of human existence, we are always in need of strength and assurance. Anywhere I am can be holy forest and sea.
Anywhere I am can be holy forest. Anywhere I am can be sacred sea. Peace and quiet can be anywhere I am. Peace and quiet within me. Anywhere I am can be holy forest. Anywhere I am can be sacred sea. Peace and quiet can be anywhere I am. Peace and quiet within me.
At celebration of life services, I often say, birth is the most important event in the life of an individual, but death is the most important event in the life of a family. When there is a death in a family, all the relationships are loosened up. And everything and everyone is vulnerable to change. People who were stuck together can now move away. And people who had been separated can now come together. That the death in a family brings a window of opportunity for people to come together in new ways. When a family does not grieve in a healthy way, then the dysfunction of that family is intensified and can affect a family for generations. And this is true of spiritual families as well. When church families do not grieve well, then they are negatively affected for generations. The loss must be named, and the stages of grief must be identified and nurtured so as to give birth to a healthier future. The usual stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. But I want to add 2 more stages to the grieving process. I want to add one stage on the front end of the process and another to the back end of the process. I want to add trauma as stage 1 and celebration as stage 7. This past July, with the death of our friend Harold Cummings, I observed the stage of trauma and shock. The trauma and shock of the loss of a loved one is close to the idea of denial, but it is distinct from denial. Denial means that on some emotional and cognitive level, there is a realization that a great loss has occurred. Otherwise, there is nothing to deny. Trauma and shock is the first stage of protection that has yet to grasp that the loss is real. Therefore, no denial as protection is necessary yet. Denial is saying on some level that the death did not happen. But trauma is walking in a stupor and a stunned state of being because of the emotional percussive blast of loss. And the last stage I want to add to the clinical model of grieving is celebration. We do not call funerals anymore. We call them celebrations of life. Funerals are too negative. And yet I am always questioning the wisdom of calling the gathering of grieving friends and family a celebration. It just might be too soon. It is almost as if we might be trying too hard to rush through the grieving process. Pastor Ken dies on Monday, and we're celebrating by Friday. How about having a time of grief and a service of comfort and hope within a week or two, and maybe a year later have a celebration of life with music, stories, and Chino Banditos? We're able to apply the idea of grief to individuals, but I want us to acknowledge that grief is also a real process for groups of people. I want us to acknowledge that how groups of people process their grief is key to their group health and well-being. There's the old preacher joke that in every church there are 3 kinds of people. Those whose pastor has just left, and those whose pastor has just come, and those whose pastor's coming very, very damn soon. And those whose pastor's coming soon. This joke is based on the truth that too many congregations have not learned that grieving is a spiritual discipline that can help people who are apart to come together and people who are together in unhealthy ways to move apart. When a congregation does not practice the spiritual discipline of grieving in an intentional way, the divisions within a congregation can go on for generations. And there are lots of examples besides the transitions of pastors. When I look over to this side of our sanctuary, I'm naming it. I'm naming it. I remember the 20 to 30 youth that used to sit together, and I feel the loss, and I grieve. I'm naming it. However, when I think about the scores of children and the youth gathering on our campus for preschool or for scouts or for the Jewish congregation or for OWL, I know that we are still providing vital, life-saving ministries to those generations. But we must practice the spiritual discipline of grief. We must name it, feel the trauma, experience the denial, go through the second guessing of bargaining, walk through the valley of depression, accept life on life's terms, and finally celebrate the deep goodness of life. We are in pain because we loved. And eventually enough time has gone by to celebrate the truth that the love was worth the pain. This is the hard work of the spiritual discipline of grief. We can make emotional and spiritual space for the wide open future. Now, there are more examples of loss among us as a congregation that require us to practice the spiritual discipline of grieving. And I want to draw that circle wider.
Gently I go, softly I know, nothing to fear, Spirit is here, love be my guide, lift me, I'll fly, far from this place, on the wings of grace. Gently I go, softly I know, nothing to fear, Spirit is here, love be my guide, lift me, I'll fly, far from this place, on the wings of grace.
The wings of grace. Certainly is our need. I remember watching the service being held at the church, and President Barack Obama broke into singing Amazing Grace. We have not learned or matured enough to grieve as a nation. Between 1890 and 1960, hundreds of statues and memorials were constructed to create hallowed ground for the lost cause of the South. These statues and memorials were erected to give a nod to history, to memorialize a past of slavery and white supremacy, and to secure a future of a social order of white supremacy by energizing bigotry and intimidating people of color. As a nation, we still have neighbors, brothers, and sisters who have not grieved the loss of privilege in a healthy way. There are people who think that if women, people of color, LGBTQIA persons, and immigrants are treated with equality, then they somehow must be losing ground. There are too many people who think that because some people are making gains up the social ladder, that means they must be falling down. You see, they are in denial. They are angry. They are bargaining. They are grieving. They are stuck. They are stuck in their grief, and so it has become complicated. And it has become compacted into trash cubes of hate and fear. This is what we saw in Charlottesville, Virginia, when a statue of Robert E. Lee was to be removed. Remember the process for the spiritual discipline of grieving. We must name it, feel the trauma, experience the denial, go through the second guessing of bargaining, walk through the valley of depression, accept life on life's terms. Then we can celebrate the deep goodness of life. We are in pain because we loved, and now enough time has gone by to celebrate the truth that the love was worth the pain. The fact that white men carried torches, defended a Confederate statue, and chanted phrases like blood and soil, and we will not be replaced, is a strong indication that we have not grieved properly. The sins of slavery and Jim Crow were not named. The trauma of the loss of perceived power and privilege was pushed deep down in some part of darkness of our national soul. Reconstruction ended too soon, and frightened, shame-filled men wore white hoods, rode horses, and created horrible, strange fruit hanging from trees. Instead of doing the necessary hard work of walking through the valley of depression, they could not accept life or history on life's terms. So they constructed a fragile social lie and erected statues to it. The spiritual discipline of grieving, as a people, as a group, as a church community, as a neighborhood, as a nation, it has not happened yet. And so it turned in on itself and became hate and fear and bitterness. The biblical story of Ruth speaks to this truth. Ruth's mother-in-law, her name was Naomi, and Naomi's name meant pleasantness. But after Naomi's husband and sons died, she said, "Don't call me Naomi anymore. My new name is Mara, which means bitter." This is what happens when we do not grieve in a healthy way. When we experience loss that shakes our foundations and drives us to our knees, we are vulnerable to bitterness and the corruption of our souls, individually and corporately. There is this gap, a gap between what is and what we know can be. There is a gap in our vision of what is and what can be. There is a gap between what is and what we are called to be. And so perhaps social justice, it doesn't begin in anger. It begins in grief. Grief between the gap of what we are called to be and what we know we can be and what we really are. A gap that can be filled only with love and our love to each other.
Nothing can shake my love. 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 Nothing can shake my love.